To the end of our deep dive on Ted Tripp's Shepherding a Child's Heart. We're in chapter 17, childhood training procedures for upper elementary and middle. So we've had this with infant and childhood, which primarily is spanking. Childhood training procedures in these years still is going to be the focus on the heart. So Tripp's not opposed to spanking older kids. He's just saying you have to amp it up for it to be painful enough. But in the older years, you're now requiring your children to be able to identify why their behaviors are wrong. Tripp is going to really go back to his appeal to the conscience so that children can understand why what they're doing is wrong. And he references again in parentheses Romans 2:14-15. He references in an earlier chapter, which says, just these two verses, whenever the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things required by the law, those who do not have the law are a law to themselves. They show that the work of the law is written in their hearts as their conscience bears witness and their conflicting thoughts accuse or else defend them. I'm recording these all in one chunk, and sometimes I just think like the nouthetic influences here are just wow. To take a couple verses from Romans, not worry about what Paul's argument is, the intense doctrinal discussion going on in this book, and be like, oh, this tells us something about the conscience, something about the heart. So ta-da, it applies to children in this way. It's pretty wild when you think of, this is kind of hermeneutics 101. Even probably a good church Bible study is going to tell you context is important when you're looking at the scriptures, and Ted and others are just not even bothering. So there are really exploiting the trust of people reading them, trusting that Ted as a pastor has probably done that due diligence so they can trust what he says about this. But basically, Ted is going to say, because of this verse, your child is always going to have a conscience that either is excusing them or accusing them. That the controversy your child has on page 175, he says, is always with God. And so you can kind of trust that their conscience is accusing or excusing them. The question I always have with this is, okay, a big piece of nouthetic counseling is that the heart is deceitful above all else. You can't trust your heart. It's constantly idolatrous. So why are people supposed to be able to trust their conscience as defined here? Their sense of guilt or sense of justification. Why? To me, this feels like this is just a path for constant introspection in this really guilt-laden way, because you can always doubt that your motivations are pure enough. You can always doubt that your actions were good enough. I don't know. It doesn't make logical sense to me, but he's gonna pop it on here, because the idea here for this age is not just to get them to obey, but to develop character and to require character development in your children. And so you're going to instruct them, you're going to define character for them in terms of who God is. And so Ted outlines a little bit of theology here, but I guess he's sort of presuming that parents will intuitively get this right, how they're framing God and his relationship to children for their children, that the task is for them to do it. He doesn't really, we're at this part in the book, so he's not really giving us, that much is left in the book. So he's not really setting out to tell parents exactly how they're going to form character, just that that's the expectation for this stage. For this to work, it really needs, and so what you begin to see on the page, like some redefinition of terms and definition of character qualities. And this is really common in authoritarian parenting. It reminds me of Gothard's redefinitions of character qualities, because you're going to have a shared family vocabulary then about these different behaviors. And there's this little chart here talking about like who I am, who God is on page 178. It's kind of like God made me, God owns me. He created the boundaries for my relationships. He's promised great blessing for me. And again, it's going to be framed in the like, if you have good character and follow God's ways, you'll be in the circle of blessing. And if you don't, you'll be outside. Also, he recommends daily reading of the Proverbs, which is another quite common way to say these kind of prescriptive guarantees are coming your way. But I'm assuming parents are still maybe relying on spanking and this age group, but Tripp, as the older ages show up in these last couple of chapters, he's about to talk about teenagers next, he kind of basically says, if you've done it right, you won't have any trouble here. So again, that is not provable. If parents, don't have compliant middle schoolers or teenagers, it's on them. They didn't follow the prescription correctly, because Tripp is saying if you've done it correctly, then you're not going to have any problems with this. You probably won't need to spank anymore. You probably won't have any other kind of behavioral problems because you'll have followed the methods right.